The rain started around 7 in the evening, the kind of rain that doesn't announce itself, that simply arrives, steady and quiet, and settles in for the night. I was standing on the front porch with one suitcase, navy blue, canvas sides. The kind of suitcase a person buys when they are young and imagines they will replace soon and then never do, because it keeps working and because replacing things that still work has never made sense to me. Inside that suitcase was everything I had been allowed to take. 3 pairs of slacks, some shirts, my shaving kit, a photograph of Eleanor in a silver frame that I had wrapped in a sweater so the glass wouldn't break, my army medals in the small box they came in, Eleanor's wedding ring on the chain I'd worn around my neck since the day she died, and our wedding album, which I had asked for specifically, and which Michael had handed me without looking at me, and which was now sitting on top of everything else inside the navy blue suitcase in the rain. The door had closed 4 minutes ago. I had not moved, not because I couldn't, because there is a specific moment when a thing has happened, when the door has closed, and the sound of it has finished traveling, and the silence after it is complete, when a man needs a moment to understand what has just become true. I understood it. I picked up the suitcase. I walked down the porch steps. I turned left on the sidewalk, and before I reached the corner, I said something, quietly, to no one in particular, or perhaps to Eleanor, which amounted to the same thing. I said, "I hope someday you understand," not as an accusation, not as a curse, just as the honest expression of what I felt, which was not anger, and was not bitterness, and was not even, in that moment, grief. It was something more like hope, stubborn, persistent, perhaps unreasonable hope, that someday my son would understand. My name is Arthur Bennett. I am 72 years old. I have lived a long life, and a mostly quiet one, and I have learned that the moments that define a person are rarely the dramatic ones. They are the quiet ones, the ones where a door has just closed, and the rain is steady, and you pick up your suitcase and walk. 3 months after that night, my son Michael walked through the doors of the most expensive nursing home in the county. He walked past the beautiful lobby and the awards on the walls and the employees who smiled at him. He walked to the reception desk, and the receptionist said, "The owner will see you now." And the door opened, and I was sitting behind the desk. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how we got there. I need to tell you about Eleanor first, because nothing about me makes sense without Eleanor. Eleanor Grace Bennett, née Morrison. Born in 1952 in a small town in Ohio, she had her mother's laugh, the kind that started somewhere deep and came out like it surprised her every time, and her father's stubbornness, which she wore much better than her father ever did. We met when we were both 24. I was trying to start a business and failing in the specific way that people fail when they are 24 and determined and have more confidence than capital. She was working at a bank, not because she loved banking, but because she was practical in the way of someone who grew up understanding that dreams require fuel. She told me on our second date that my business plan had 3 structural problems, and that she had identified all of them by the time I finished explaining it on our first date, but had chosen not to say anything because she wanted to see if I'd figure them out myself. I said, "Had I?" She said, "You were getting there." We were married within the year. She was right about the structural problems. She was right about most things. We had Michael when we were 29. He was the kind of baby who looks at the world with complete seriousness from the very beginning, as if he arrived already forming opinions. He had my dark hair and Eleanor's eyes, and a quality of determination that showed up early and stayed. I built the business while Michael grew up. Not dramatically, not with a single brilliant moment or a lucky break. The way most things are actually built, slowly, carefully, with long hours and patient decisions, and the willingness to be wrong and correct and try again. By the time Michael was in high school, The business was what I had hoped it would be. I want to be specific about what I built, because it matters to the story. In 1987, after 15 years in commercial real estate development, I made a pivot. Eleanor's mother had been placed in a nursing facility, the only one available in their area, which was underfunded and understaffed and managed with the specific indifference of a place that knows it has no competition. Eleanor visited her mother twice a week for 2 years. She came home from those visits with a quality in her face that I recognized as the specific grief of someone watching something happen that should not be happening. She said to me one evening, "Arthur, these places, the way people are treated, like they're a problem being managed, not like they're people." I said, "What would you do about it?" She said, "Build something different." I said, "Tell me what different looks like." She told me. I spent the next 3 years building it. Magnolia Gardens Senior Care, which is not a dramatic name. Eleanor chose it specifically because she did not want a dramatic name. She wanted something that sounded like a place you might choose to spend an afternoon, not a place where you waited out the end of things. We opened in 1990, one facility, 42 residents, 12 staff members who Eleanor personally interviewed and whose primary qualification, in her estimation, was not their credentials, but their answer to one question: tell me about someone older than you that you love. If the answer was specific, a grandmother's specific laugh, a grandfather's particular habit, the specific thing this person did when they were proud of you, Eleanor hired them. If the answer was general, kind people deserve dignity, Eleanor thanked them and wished them well. We grew slowly. A second facility in 1996, a third in 2003. By the time Eleanor was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in 2018, Magnolia Gardens had 6 facilities across the county and a waiting list at every one of them. Eleanor died in April of 2019. She was 67 years old. I sat with her at the end, in the facility we had built together, in a room that I had designed because I knew someday someone I loved might need it. And I held her hand and I talked to her about ordinary things. The garden, a book she had been reading, the birds that came to the feeder outside her window, until the talking was no longer necessary. I wore her ring on the chain after that. I went back to work for 6 months, because work was what I knew to do when I didn't know what else to do. And then Michael called and said, "Dad, come live with us. The kids miss you. You shouldn't be alone in that house." I said yes, because I trusted my son, because I missed my grandchildren, because Eleanor would have said go. The first months were good. Michael and Emily's house was on a quiet street, in a suburb, 40 minutes from where I had lived with Eleanor. It had a backyard with an old maple tree that Lily, my granddaughter, who was 10 at the time, had hung a tire swing from with her father's help, or so I was told. The tire swing had not been used in 2 years because Lily had decided she was too old for tire swings, which she told me with the specific certainty of a 10-year-old who has recently made a determination about maturity. I said, "I think I might be too old for tire swings too." She considered this seriously. Then she said, "We could try together and see." We tried together. We were both too old. It was the best afternoon I had had since Eleanor died. I settled into a routine that I found genuinely good. I woke early. I have always woken early. It is one of those habits that establishes itself in youth and becomes structural, and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table in the specific quiet of a house before the rest of it wakes up. I fed the birds. I had discovered, sometime in my 60s, that I was the kind of person who fed birds. Eleanor had found this funny. She said, "You spent 40 years managing commercial real estate, and now you're buying seed for sparrows." I said the sparrows seemed to appreciate it more than the commercial real estate clients. She said that was probably fair. I cooked dinner 3 nights a week, not because anyone asked me to, because it was something I could do, and doing things that are useful, has always felt better to me than being taken care of. I fixed the faucet in the upstairs bathroom that had been dripping for, by Emily's account, 6 months. I helped Lily with her homework, mathematics, which was not my strongest subject, but which we worked through together with a patience that Lily said her teacher did not always have, which I chose to take as a compliment. I drove James, my grandson who was 7, to his Tuesday soccer practice when Michael and Emily were both working late. I was, in the language of people who study these things, a contributing household member. I was also, in the language of a daughter-in-law who had not signed up for a live-in father-in-law, a complication. I knew this. I had known it from the beginning. Emily was not unkind to me. I want to say that clearly, because it is true, and because the truth matters more than the simpler version. She was not unkind. She was a woman under pressure. The mortgage, Michael's business which had been struggling for 2 years, her own job, 2 children, a household, and the addition of a 72-year-old man to that equation had added a dimension that she had not fully calculated when Michael made the invitation. I heard her say, one Tuesday evening, when she believed I was upstairs, "I just think we need our space, Michael. It's been 8 months." Michael said, "He's my father." She said, "I know he is." Michael said, "He doesn't have anywhere else to go." This was not entirely true, but I understood why he said it, and I understood why she accepted it, and I chose not to correct it. I went back upstairs. I sat in the chair by the window in the room they had given me, and I thought about Eleanor. She would have known from the first week what was going to happen. She would have had a plan. I thought about the plan I had been carrying, quietly, for the last several months. The thing I had not mentioned to Michael, or to anyone, not because I was hiding it, because I was not ready to need it yet. The months continued. Michael's business stress increased in the specific accumulating way of financial pressure that does not announce itself with a single crisis, but with a series of smaller ones that compound. A contract fell through in January. A loan application was delayed in February. By March, the conversations I overheard had a different quality. Not just tired, but frightened. Emily's voice, late one evening. "Michael, we have to make some decisions." Michael, "I know." Emily, "About everything. The house, your father, everything." A long silence. Then Michael, "Let me think about it." I sat with my coffee the next morning, and I fed the birds, and I thought about what I needed to do. Michael came to my room on a Sunday afternoon. He knocked, which he had always done, which was one of the things about Michael that I had always appreciated, the specific courtesy of a knock. I said, "Come in." He came in. He sat in the chair across from mine. He looked at his hands for a moment. I waited. "I have always been good at waiting," he said. "Dad, I need to talk to you about something." I said, "All right." He said, "Emily and I have been talking. About the situation. About—" He stopped. "About the long term." I said, "I see." He said, "We've found a place. For seniors. It's a good place. It has activities and a medical staff and—" I said, "What's it called?" He said, "Sunrise Gardens. It's about 20 minutes from here." I said, "I don't know that one." He said, "It has good reviews." I said, "When?" He said, "We were thinking soon would be better for everyone to have a clean transition." I looked at my son, 45 years old. The dark hair had some gray in it now, at the temples. He had Eleanor's eyes, which made this moment more difficult than it might otherwise have been. I said, "Michael, can I ask you something?" He said, "Of course." I said, "When did I stop being your family?" He said, "Dad, that's not what this is." I said, "Then what is it?" He was quiet. I said, "I cook dinner. I drive James to practice. I help Lily with her homework. I fix things when they break. I try, Michael, to be as useful as I can and as unobtrusive as I can simultaneously, which is a difficult balance, and which I have been maintaining for 8 months. He said, I know. I said, and I am not asking for credit for any of it. I am asking to understand what has changed. He said, Dad, it's complicated. I said, family always is. He said, we need our space. Emily and I need to manage our own lives, and having you here makes it. He stopped again. I said, harder. He said, yes. I looked out the window. The maple tree, the tire swing that neither Lily nor I could use anymore. I said, all right, Michael. He said, it's a good place. I said, I'm sure it is. He said, I'll help you pack if. I said, I'll manage. He said, Dad. I said, I'll manage, Michael. He left the room. I sat in the chair for a while. Then I opened the closet. I took out the navy blue suitcase, and I made the decisions that a person makes when they are reducing a life to what fits in one bag, what is necessary, what is meaningful, what can be held. Lily found me packing. She stood in the doorway in her socks, and she looked at the suitcase, and then at me, and then at the suitcase again. She said, Grandpa, what are you doing? I said, getting organized. She said, are you going somewhere? I said, for a little while. She said, where? I said, somewhere comfortable. She said, but you'll come back. I looked at my granddaughter, 10 years old. Eleanor's laugh, which had started to show itself in the last year in exactly the way I had hoped it would. I said, I will always come back for you. That is a promise. She said, okay. She stood in the doorway for another moment. Then she came across the room and she hugged me, completely, with the full weight of a 10-year-old who does not yet know how to hug partially. I held on. That evening, Michael carried the suitcase to the front door. He said, the car will come in the morning. I said, I'll manage tonight. He said, Dad, you don't have to. I said, Michael, I'm fine. He said, I hope you understand that this isn't about. I said, I know what it's about. He said, you're not my responsibility. The words landed. I looked at my son. I said, no, I suppose I'm not. I picked up the suitcase. No, I walked to the door, and outside, the rain had started. I did not take the car that Michael had arranged. I called a different number. The phone rang twice. A woman answered. She said, Magnolia Gardens, this is Christine. How can I help you? I said, Christine, it's Arthur. I'm going to need a car. A brief pause. Then, Mr. Bennett, of course. We'll have someone there in 15 minutes. I said, thank you. The car arrived in 12. The driver, a young man named Marcus, who had worked for us for 3 years, did not ask questions. He took the suitcase. He opened the door. He drove. We arrived at the main facility 20 minutes later, Magnolia Gardens Senior Care, the building I had started designing in 1987, on a yellow legal pad at the kitchen table, while Eleanor sat across from me, drinking tea and telling me what she needed it to be. The lobby was lit warmly at this hour. The front desk receptionist, a woman named Helen, who had been with us for 11 years, stood when she saw me come through the doors. She said, welcome back, Mr. Bennett. I said, thank you, Helen. I'll be staying for a while. She said, your suite is ready. Patricia had it prepared this afternoon. Patricia was my director of operations. She had called me 2 hours before the conversation with Michael, because I had called her 2 hours before that conversation, because I had understood for several weeks that the conversation was coming. I had not mentioned this to Michael, not out of deception, out of the specific privacy that belongs to a person managing their own life. I rode the elevator to the 3rd floor. The suite was on the corner, which meant it had 2 windows. Eleanor had always believed in corners. She said, a room with 2 windows has twice as much sky. The suite had a small sitting room, a bedroom, a bathroom with a walk-in shower, and a desk. On the desk, someone, Patricia, almost certainly, had placed a small vase with 3 white roses. I set down the suitcase. I took out the photograph of Eleanor. I placed it on the desk beside the roses. I sat in the chair by the window. Outside, the rain was still coming down, steady and quiet. I said, "Well, here we are." I was not speaking to the room. I slept better that night than I had in months. What I had not told Michael, what I had not told anyone in the family, including Eleanor's sister Patricia, who visited twice a year and who would have had strong opinions about the situation, was the current state of what I had built. Magnolia Gardens Senior Care was not the organization it had been when Eleanor died. In the 18 months between her death and Michael's invitation to come and live with them, I had worked, not because I needed to, because work, in the specific form of building something that Eleanor had believed in, was how I processed grief. I had expanded. The 6th facility had been joined by a 7th and an 8th. A partnership with a regional hospital system had been established. A foundation, the Eleanor Bennett Foundation for Senior Dignity, which was Eleanor's phrase and the only name I ever considered, had been endowed and was now funding research into senior care standards nationally. The organization that had started with 1 building and 42 residents was now the largest private senior care operation in the county. I had chosen not to mention this to Michael, not strategically. Out of the same reason, I had never led with it in my family life. I wanted people to love me as Arthur, not as the man who owned the nursing homes. Eleanor had always understood this. She used to say, "Arthur, you've spent your whole life making sure people don't know how much you've given them. Someday that's going to cause you a problem." She was right, as she usually was. The 3 months at Magnolia Gardens were not unhappy months. I worked in the mornings. I sat on the garden terrace in the afternoons, which had the specific quality of good outdoor spaces, not dramatic, but honest, with comfortable chairs and planters that needed tending, and the particular peace of a place designed to be used slowly. I had lunch with residents who became, over those 3 months, something like community. A woman named Ruth, who had been a high school English teacher for 30 years, and who had opinions about every book I mentioned, and was almost always right. A man named Harold, who had been a carpenter, and who spent his afternoons working in the woodshop we had built, specifically because Eleanor had believed that people needed to make things with their hands at every age. I called Lily every Sunday. She answered every time, which told me she had been told to expect my call, which told me either Michael or Emily had had the decency to make sure she had my number. She told me about school, about her friend group, about a book she was reading, about the tire swing, which she had started using again, which she reported with the specific casualness of someone who has made a private decision to unmake a previous determination about maturity and does not want this noted directly. I did not note it directly. I said, "The tree needs that swing." She said, "I know. I'm doing it a favor." She made me laugh every Sunday. I was working on a morning in early December, reviewing the staffing plan for the new facility that was opening in February, when Patricia knocked and came in. She said, "Arthur, I have a family inquiry about a placement." I said, "What kind of placement?" She said, "A mother-in-law. The family is looking at a long-term arrangement, premium level." I said, "Is there a problem with the intake process?" She said, "No, it's just—" She paused. "Arthur, the family name is Bennett." I looked up. She said, "Michael Bennett. He's requesting a consultation." I sat with that for a moment. I thought about Eleanor. I thought about what she would say. She would say, "Let him come." I said, "Schedule the consultation. Standard process. Don't mention my name." Patricia said, "Are you sure?" I said, "I'm sure." Michael arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. I watched him from my office window as he pulled into the parking lot. He was driving the same car. He looked tired, the specific tired of someone who has been carrying financial worry for long enough that it has settled into his posture. I watched him straighten when he got out of the car. The habit of composure. He had that from me. He came through the lobby doors. I gave him 10 minutes in the lobby, enough time to see the space, the awards on the walls, the photograph of Eleanor in the display case near the main desk that had been there since the day we opened and that I had refused to move regardless of what any interior designer suggested. Patricia met him. She walked him through the intake process. She showed him the facilities. She answered his questions with the thoroughness that I required of everyone in my operation, because thoroughness is the fundamental form of respect. At the end of the walkthrough, she brought him to my office. She knocked. I said, "Come in." She opened the door. Michael came in. He saw me, and he stopped. The specific kind of stop that happens when what a person is looking at requires a complete recalibration of their understanding of the room they are standing in. He stood in the doorway. I was behind the desk. I was wearing the grey suit that Eleanor had picked out for me 12 years ago and that still fit because I had not significantly changed in 12 years in the ways that suits measure. I said, "Michael, come in. Sit down." He came in. He sat down. He said nothing for a long moment. He looked at the desk, at the photograph of Eleanor on the credenza behind me, at the awards on the wall, at the nameplate on the desk. A.R. Bennett, owner and founder. He said, "Dad." I said, "Yes." He said, "You own this." I said, "I built it in 1990. With your mother." He said, "I didn't know." I said, "No." He said, "How is that?" He stopped. "How did I not know?" I said, "Because I never told you, and because you never asked." He looked at the photograph of Eleanor. He said, "Mom knew." I said, "It was her idea, in a sense. She's the one who told me what it needed to be." He looked at his hands. He said, "Why didn't you tell me? When I was struggling, when the business was—" I said, "Because you didn't ask me about my work in 20 years, Michael. And because I wanted your love, not your management." He looked up. I said, "I have been, in my adult life, a reasonably successful businessman. That is the accurate description. I built something. Your mother and I built it together. I never led with it, because it was never the most important thing about me. Do you understand that?" He said, "Yes." I said, "The most important thing about me was that I was your father, and Eleanor's husband, and your children's grandfather. The business was what I did with my days. It was not who I was." He said, "Dad." I said, "Michael, let me finish." He was quiet. I said, 3 months ago, you stood at your front door in the rain, and you told me I was not your responsibility. I have thought about those words many times since then." He said, "Dad, I said, "I'm not finished." He waited. I said, "I was not angry at you. I want you to know that. I was not angry at Emily. I understood the pressure you were under. I understood that my presence in your house had become a weight that was added to other weights, and that the combination had become too much." I said, "What I was not able to understand, and what I am still working to understand, is when I became a burden rather than a father." I said, "At what point did the man who drove you to school and helped you with your homework and sat with you when you were sick and walked you through starting your first business, at what point did he become a problem to be managed rather than a parent to be valued?" Michael's eyes were wet. He did not speak. I said, "I am not asking this to cause you pain. I am asking because I genuinely want to understand, and because I think you need to ask yourself that question and sit with the answer." He said quietly, "I don't have a good answer." I said, "I know." I said, "Michael, I am your father, not because you need me to be, or because it benefits you, or because I own a building, because I am. That does not change based on what is convenient." He said, "I know." I said, "You are my son. That does not change either. Which is why I am going to help you, with Emily's mother, with the placement, with whatever the process requires. He looked up. I said, "But I need something from you in return. Not money, not acknowledgement. I need you to make an appointment with a family counselor. All of us. You, Emily, and me. Because there are things we have not said to each other that need to be said in the right room with the right help." He said, "Dad, you don't have to." I said, "I know I don't have to. I'm choosing to. There is a difference." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "When did I stop being your son? I mean, when did it stop being the thing you led with?" I looked at him. I said, "It never did." He said, "Even after." I said, "Even after." He looked at his hands again. He said, "I'm sorry, Dad." I said, "I know you are." He said, "I don't know how to." I said, "You start with the counselor, and you come to Sunday dinner, here in this building, at the table I have lunch at every day. You and Emily and Lily and James, and we start from there." He said, "Here?" I said, "The food is excellent. I designed the kitchen myself." He almost smiled. Then the tears came, not dramatically. The quiet tears of a man who has been carrying something heavy and has just been given, unexpectedly, permission to set it down. I came around the desk. I sat in the chair beside him. I put my hand on his shoulder. I did not say anything. I have been his father for 45 years. I know when he needs words and when he needs presence. He needed presence. We sat in my office for a while. The December light was going orange through the window. The family counselor's name was Dr. Sandra Webb. She had a practice 40 minutes from the facility. She had been recommended by 3 different people I respected. She met with Michael and Emily first, and then with me alone, and then with all of us together. The first combined session was uncomfortable, in the specific way that honest conversations always are. Emily said things she had been carrying for a long time. I said things I had not said. Michael said things that surprised both of us. Dr. Webb said very little, which is the mark of a good counselor. By the end of the session, nothing was resolved. Nothing is resolved in an hour. But something had shifted, the specific shift that happens when people who love each other have been given permission to say what is actually true. Emily found me in the hallway after. She said, "Arthur, I need to say something." I said, "All right." She said, "I told Michael you were a burden." I used that word. In our kitchen. I said it more than once. I said, "I know." She said, "I'm sorry." I said, "Emily, you were under pressure. You were frightened. People say things under pressure that they would not say in a quieter moment." She said, "That's a very generous way to hear it." I said, "I've had 3 months to decide how to hear it." She said, "Why are you helping us?" "After," I said, "because you're my family, and because your mother deserves to spend her time somewhere good, and because Lily needs her grandfather." She said, "We don't deserve." I said, "That's not how family works. Family isn't about what you deserve. It's about what you choose." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Michael's business. It's in serious trouble." I said, "I know." She said, "We might lose the house." I said, "I know that too." She said, "I'm not asking." I said, "I know you're not." I said, "Let me talk to Michael." She said, "Arthur." I said, "Let me talk to my son." Sunday dinner at Magnolia Gardens began the week after the first counseling session. Lily came the first Sunday and spent 45 minutes in the woodshop with Harold, who showed her how to make a small box from pine, which she brought home and presented to Emily as a gift. James decided, by his second visit, that the garden terrace was an excellent place to run, which the other residents found either charming or exhausting, depending on the individual. Ruth gave Lily 3 book recommendations, which Lily treated with the seriousness they deserved. And Michael and I began, slowly and imperfectly and without a specific plan, to talk to each other the way a father and son should talk. We talked about Eleanor. about his memory of her versus mine, about the specific way she had laughed and the specific things she had believed. We talked about his business, about what had gone wrong and what might be salvaged and what had to be let go. I did not solve it for him. I helped him think through it, which is a different thing and a better one. We talked about the night in the rain, not once, several times, because once is never enough for the things that matter. He said, on one of those occasions, "What did you mean when you said you hoped I'd understand someday?" I said, "I meant that I hoped you would someday have the experience of loving someone who needed you and understanding that the needing was not a burden, it was an honor." He said, "Dad?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I'm starting to understand." I said, "Good." Spring came to the garden at Magnolia Gardens in the way it always came, without announcement. Simply one morning there were green things where the previous morning there had not been. I walked there on a Thursday morning in April. The roses were starting. Eleanor had always said, a garden's health is measured by its roses, which is not botanically accurate, but which I had long since stopped needing to be accurate about. I sat on the bench in the corner. I had the photograph with me, not the framed one from the desk. A smaller one, the one from our first year, when we were 26, and the business was not yet what it would become, and Eleanor had her hair longer than she wore it later, and was laughing at something off camera that I cannot remember, but that must have been worth laughing at. I said, "We kept our promise." The promise had been made in 1987, Eleanor had said, looking at the legal pad with the first plans. "Arthur, promise me, no senior should ever feel abandoned, no matter what happens with the business or the money or anything else. That's what this is for." I had promised. We had kept it. The gardens I had built, the wings named after donors, and the common rooms named for the values Eleanor had listed on that legal pad, dignity, comfort, belonging, were full of people who had been kept from being abandoned. Some of them, like Ruth and Harold, had become more like family than residents. All of them were the promise, made visible. I looked at the photograph. I said, "The rose by the east wall is going to be spectacular this year. I think you would approve." The garden was quiet, just birds, just spring light, just the specific piece of a place that has been built with the right intentions by people who meant what they said. I heard footsteps behind me. Lily came around the corner. She had her camera. She had started carrying a camera in the last month, which I took as an encouraging sign about the direction of her interests. She said, "Grandpa, I want to take your picture." I said, "Right now?" She said, "You look nice in this light." I said, "I look 72 in any light." She said, "That's what looks nice." I sat on the bench. She raised the camera. She said, "Look at the roses." I looked at the roses. She took the picture. She lowered the camera and looked at the screen. She said, "Grandpa, this is my favorite picture I've ever taken." I said, "Of what?" She said, "Of anything." I looked at my granddaughter, 10 years old, Eleanor's laugh, the tire swing she had gone back to because trees need their swings. I said, "Come sit with me." She came and sat beside me on the bench. I showed her the photograph I had been holding. She said, "Is that Grandma Eleanor?" I said, "When she was young." She said, "She looks like she's laughing at something really good." I said, "She usually was." We sat in the garden together, just the two of us, the spring morning doing what spring mornings do. I want to leave you with something I have learned, not from the business, not from the years of building and managing and making decisions, from the simpler things. The navy blue suitcase in the rain, the photograph of Eleanor in its silver frame, the window with 2 windows, because Eleanor believed in twice as much sky. What I have learned is this: dignity is not something that other people give you, it is something you carry. When Michael stood at that door, and the rain was coming down, and the door was closed, I had a choice about what to pick up when I picked up the suitcase. I could have picked up anger, I could have picked up bitterness. I could have picked up the particular grievance of a man who has given everything and been told he is not a responsibility. I picked up the suitcase, and I walked, because I had somewhere to go. Not just the facility, though that is where I went, but somewhere more essential than that. I had a life that I had built with intention and care and love. I had a promise that I had made to Eleanor and kept for 30 years. I had Lily's Sunday phone calls and Harold's woodshop and Ruth's book recommendations and the rose by the east wall that was going to be spectacular this spring. I had who I was, and no one, not the rain, not the closed door, not the words, not your responsibility, could take that from me. The most important thing I want to say to anyone who is where I was, who is standing in the rain, or has been, or is afraid they will be, is this. You are not defined by who has put you down. You are defined by what you have built, by the promises you have kept, by the people who carry photographs of you and say this is the best picture I have ever taken, by the windows you have put in the right walls, by the rings you have worn on chains, by the gardens you have tended. Michael and I are not where we were. We are somewhere new, something that is less like a repair and more like a beginning, the specific beginning of a relationship between two adults who have been honest with each other for the first time. It is better than what we had. Not because of the nursing home, not because of anything I own, because of one session with a counselor and one Sunday dinner and one honest conversation, and then another. Because family, when it chooses to be, is the most durable thing. More durable than the closed door, more durable than the rain. I walk through the garden at Magnolia Gardens on Thursday mornings. The rose by the east wall is coming in beautifully. Eleanor would approve. I am 72 years old. I keep my promises, and I still feed the birds. I'll see you in the next one.